Hey, everybody, welcome back to the program. Nice to see you all. Unfortunately, as you all know, it's been a hefty few weeks with the fall of Syria. There has been shock and complete devastation, emotions felt by everybody who stood by Syria, supported for 14 years a secular Syria that we watched go through so much strife and so much total directed anger by the West. And we watched secular Syria's actual freedom from the oppressive clutches of the West and the so-called Western democracy. We saw Syria be free of all of that and of its terrorist entities, in spite of the fact that Syria has continuously fought these entities for years now, along with Russia. And now to watch it all fall in less than 2 weeks was a shock that I don't think anybody has still gotten over, especially when we talk about the Syrian people themselves, watching them flee, watching them have to take away their whole lives and in a matter of hours or less, and just be fearful of not knowing what's to come and leave everything behind essentially, and or stay at the mercy of these rebranded terrorists that HTS are, the soldiers of Washington and Zionist Israel. Now, we've also witnessed the assassinations online of the persecutions of former Syrian Arab Army soldiers, but also the Shia Muslims and the Alawites that we have also seen, just completely disgusting images that are hard to describe, but I think need to be talked about in order for people to understand the gravity of what's happened. Um, and we've also seen Israel completely bomb Syria endlessly. Not that they didn't before, but this time, obviously, it's different, destroying everything it can, not just military targets, but everything that they can. And of course, receiving zero restraint or zero pushback from the so called new democratic government that's taken in. This also, while the UK and Washington are now expanding their hold and are being invited to take what's left of the corpse of a truly modern and advanced society that Syria was. And I think a lot of people didn't even realize that. How could this have happened? These are the questions that we have been asking ourselves. What could have been done? Who's to blame? All of these questions I have seen be asked online by pundits, by journalists, by anybody that has an interest in Syria and Syria's story. And we have been trying to find these answers, but watching now the jihadists take over while CNN rebrands this new version of Julani as a new Boy Scout, another Zelensky, somebody that is not a head chopping terrorist, is of course crazy, but this is something that they've done before many times, so it's not surprising. But to me, what's been more surprising is watching former supporters of Syria's former government blame Assad, and not just blame Assad, but blame all Arabs, blame all Syrians, and talk of also unity and diplomacy with actual terrorists. It just feels like we're living in some sort of twilight zone of sorts. And I'm genuinely asking if people have lost their minds. And it also seems like there's no integrity with some, or it's in low supply in media. And I've seen many popular commentators say, Palestinians are to blame, that they're done with the Arabs. And this notion of just blaming Assad and Syria seems to me completely ignoring the obvious culprits behind all of this that you can trace everything back to. And this is mostly coming from Western pundits and Western commentators who have zero reality of understanding what something like this might have felt like in Syria, or what any of the people of the region have remotely experienced, especially in the last year. But you could talk about decades and decades of destruction made by the very people of our own Western governments, the very puppet masters that have been in play. So it's arrogant, but it's ridiculously just completely out of touch to make these sort of comments when you're coming from a privileged Western country that is directly, completely guilty of doing this. And again, they haven't experienced an ounce or a fraction of what these people are experiencing. And it does seem purposeful to divert the attention from Israel, from NATO, from the United States, and from perhaps potential allies that have let Syria down. And there's so much to be discussed about that, precisely because it is important for the entirety of the global south. It is important when people have given bricks and this idea of multipolarity rose colored glasses and have not taken them off yet. It's important to understand that. And of course, by the way, Israel has struck Syria over 500 times since, seized much of its territory in the Golan, and has plans to stay and take over. And they've been completely invited by this new terrorist regime. And for more on this, I just want to go back to our friend, independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, who had to leave Damascus to try to make it out of there quickly, and who left and thankfully got out of there safe. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in Vanessa. Vanessa, nice to see you, but I know it's been difficult, to say the least. An understatement. But I first of all just want to say I'm glad you're safe. Um, and I've read your Substack. I've heard some of the interviews you've done and what it's been like. I'm also aware that not many in Syria themselves have been able to leave and can't go back, or if they've left, they haven't left with much. So of course, Syrians are the victims of everything. And we know that the media is trying to rehabilitate these terrorists, which is not surprising, as I stated. But I just want you to walk us through what you witnessed when you saw this incoming of terrorists, but also what you have seen since leaving Syria in comparison to the Syria that you used to know.
I don't think it can be described as the Syria that I used to know. I think that disappeared even from the beginning when Aleppo was first invaded. This time round, of course, it was first invaded back in 2012 by Erdogan's proxy Al-Tawid brigade that basically dismantled all of the industrial areas and took them back to Turkey and stripped Aleppo bare that time round. So as soon as they entered Aleppo, there was a feeling in Syria that nothing was going to be the same again. And of course, this was also enabled, we talked about this, by the tsunami of panic-stricken social media commentators who were feeding the panic of the Syrian people also, which is really not helpful in what is already a very tense and confused situation. I mean, I've talked about what happened. I mean, basically, the full the traveling of the terrorists, let's say, from when Homs was surrendered to Damascus was incredibly fast, but I wouldn't say that the actual military arm of all of these foreign mercenaries and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham dominated groups were the ones that we heard entering. These were factions that previously had probably taken amnesty and reconciliation from the government during the bulk of the fighting from 2011 until 2020, and who saw their opportunity to come into Damascus and start looting and destroying and stealing cars and so on. So, they were the criminal vanguard of the actual military terrorist forces that were on their way. And those are the ones who entered where I was living and entered much of the suburbs of Damascus very early on Saturday night. and started firing guns into the gardens and firing guns at everything and stealing cars and looting empty houses, because a lot of people had evacuated in preparation for any kind of, at that time they thought, fighting. And perhaps none of us expected the complete surrender of the Syrian army and basically the enablement of the terrorist factions and their kind of criminal cohorts to just enter completely unimpeded, but they did. And so finally on the Sunday morning, I managed to get hold of a driver who had the guts basically to to put all my things in the car, even though we were surrounded by these armed thugs, get me through the various checkpoints and then get me through the border where they were looting everything in sight. So I benefited from the fact that their focus was on stealing and not on what I was doing and who I was and why I was leaving through the border, which had absolutely no security or police. My passport wasn't stamped. And since then, of course, there's been a really heavy flow of people trying to leave Syria. First of all, they headed to the coast, to the areas of Tartus and Latakia, because it was considered that those would remain safe areas. Of course, now they're not. That we know that there are ethnic cleansing programs going on in the countryside of both coastal areas and Homs in particular. And the terrorists have actually invaded even those areas. So they're living among their prime targets, let's say, which are the Alawite and the Shia and even the Christian communities in Syria that have taken shelter on that kind of coastal rump of Syria. And I know for a fact there are still a number of people who are on the terrorist witch hunt lists who are still stuck inside Syria and who are trying to find their way out. There are thousands of Shia and Alawite that have gathered at the Lebanese border, the main Lebanese border, because Israel bombed the Tartus border just before the HTS attack. Of course, I'm sure that's coincidental. So most of them are gathering at the Masna border, which is the main border, but many of them don't have the paperwork or the visas. And Lebanon has now stopped visas for everyone to basically corral them at the border rather than allowing them into Lebanon. I think around 5,000 have entered Lebanon, and the majority of those have actually traveled on, I think probably to Iraq. So a number has come in, but there is still a large number gathering at the border waiting to get out.
You know, when you mention people leaving, a lot of the other narrative is, oh, people are coming back because it's safe now. Syria is safe now. I mean, that's what we've even heard from some people. I've heard from some people personally that are like, well, you know, now I can have my business. Now everything can go back to normal. There's that perspective. So I'm glad you're talking about people leaving, because
Yeah.
that one's been dominating. Oh, people are just going to go back and live their lives now. They, you know, the Assad regime is gone. Now we can go back. Can you say anything to that about people going back? Is it a certain kind of people? Like, because it's not, you can't go back. Other people who are on this terrorist watch list can't go back. What are the, I guess, the different variations of that?
Well, I mean, this is actually the perfect demonstration of. I think hypocrisy is too small an expression to describe it, of the EU, who are now closing their borders to refugees from Syria and incentivizing refugees that were enabled, in fact, encouraged to enter Europe, that came, a large number of them came from within the extremist armed groups that were being used by the West to topple the Syrian government from 2011 onwards. I'm not saying all of them. There were some genuine refugees, particularly among the Christian communities, but most of them went to Canada. To Europe, I would say the large majority came from within the extremist factions that were fleeing as the Syrian Arab Army and their allies were liberating areas inside Syria. now those groups that have, been living in sort of Islamist enclaves in many countries of the EU are now being incentivized with 1,000 euros per head to go back to the terrorist Syria that they fled, right? So of course they're going to be welcome, and not only are they going to be welcome, they're actually being paid by the EU to go back and fortify the terrorist forces that are in control of Syria. However, the genuine refugees, the ones that fled the terrorist invasion from 2011 onwards, are not going to be safe back in Syria. So what's going to happen to them? They're in a sort of catch-22 situation. It's not safe for them to come back. And I think the most disgusting thing is the closure of borders to genuine refugees from minority sects now that are fearful for their lives. And there are multiple videos now circulating. There's a recent one that I saw today of a tribe, an Alawite tribe, who are being told which members are being targeted for slaughter, which are going to be deported for life, and which are going to be deported for 10 years. This is something which is ongoing underneath the radar of Western terrorist aligned and apologist media outlets that are on the ground, as you said, regurgitating the propaganda from 2011 onwards as if it's suddenly new and it hasn't already been debunked 500 times, to post presidency vilify President Assad and his government, and to, I don't know, represent these terrorist creatures who carried out some of the worst atrocities in the history of mankind against Syrian people and against the same sects and communities and minorities that they are now targeting again. But what is the media doing? Of course, it's presenting this kind of epiphany vision of Jolani and Alouche and all of these terrorists who really were some of the most brutal monsters on this earth, both in Iraq and in Syria. So it's demonic, actually, in my opinion. I know we're using a lot of hyperbole, but it's because I can't think of any other words to describe what is actually happening right now.
Yeah, it feels like a giant gaslight. What you just described, and I'm glad you described it, paying people to go back to show this public relations image that it is now safe to go back in Syria, while simultaneously preventing people whose lives are in danger from seeking refuge. It is disgusting. I don't know what other word.
Sorry, they also monetize them to amplify the refugee crisis narrative.
Yeah.
So they monetize them the other way around also to have this flood of refugees because Assad is bombing everywhere. That was the narrative, right? So both ways, they're being basically incentivized, not coerced, incentivized to serve their narratives in Syria. It's extraordinary. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, and it further brainwashes these people too against their own interests, and I've seen that happen way too many times in so many countries. One of the things that's also been completely warped is, and we talked a little bit about it last time, is how Assad and the Syrian government have been fully blamed. There has been no empathy shown, by the way, to a lot of these people, these soldiers from the Syrian Arab Army who sacrificed their lives, their everything for years. They've just been told that they are weak, that they don't know what they're doing, that they were just complete cowards. I mean, this is what I've seen online from people who supposedly, supported Syria. I mean, it's not, and I've seen it, coming from Russian commentators and journalists, and also from people in the West that said that they supported Syria and Bashar al-Assad, suddenly flip and start saying, well, Assad had many problems and this and that. Of course, Syria had problems, and you've talked about that as well. But this is what I'm seeing is just zero empathy to people who should be getting more of like, oh, thank you for what you did, what you tried to do for all these years of fighting these terrorists, and laying it out to the West, telling the West to go to hell essentially, and continuing to try to create a secular free Syria where, you know, there was so much it was actually what the West thinks they describe when they describe something of a democracy. It is definitely not the Western version that they seek. But I guess my question to you is, what about this? What do you make of this sort of turn of focusing only on Assad, the Syrian Arab Army, their failures, and just even Arabs and then
Yeah,
Palestinians? They're all to blame,
yeah, I know.
except the ones who should be.
Yeah, I know. It's incredibly disorienting, actually. Not only for me and for you and for other people who followed the Syrian cause for years now, but even for Syrians. I mean, they're just in such a deep, dark vacuum right now. And you know, I was speaking to people right at the beginning, and to some degree, yeah, they were optimistic. They said, "Oh well, it's got to be better than what we've been living through for the last 14 years." Now, I spoke to a couple of the same people today. They said, "Oh my God, you were right. Like it's 10 times worse, and I wish that this had never happened." You know, and how many times do we see this? I mean, with Gaddafi, with Mubarak, with Saddam Hussein. How many times a few years later do you hear people saying, "God, I wish we still had Mubarak, or I wish we still had Saddam Hussein," and so on. You know, and one can say, "Okay, this means that Arabs are easy manipulated," but my argument is like, I don't think any other region has been under such a concerted, intelligent, media complex attack for as long as West Asia has. You know, when you have areas in Syria that were occupied by the terrorists from 2011 onwards, where the people in those environments, under the occupation, incarcerated in areas with very little internet access, very little outside news, actually started to be gaslighted into believing that if the Syrian army liberated them, they would massacre them. You know, so that's how easy it is. And if you look at Gaza, it's a concentration camp. There's very little information allowed in except what is suitable to gaslight them into believing the anti-Syria narrative, for example, right? So people really, before they condemn all Muslims or before they condemn all Arabs for yet again falling for it, they should live through the hundreds of years of manipulation from the Crusaders onwards, if we're going to begin back there. Centuries of manipulation and land grabs and power grabs and empire fluctuation and so on, leading to where we are now, where, you know, we're in an almost unprecedented kind of global war, an undeclared global war that is ongoing, with West Asia at the center of it. So of course the attack and the gaslighting and the mind manipulation is going to be off the scale, and that is really what is happening. Even, you know, under President Assad, and particularly since 2020, after Trump put on the Caesar sanctions and continued to occupy oil and agricultural resources in the Northeast, basically suffocated the Syrian people. And it's true, that was their intention. This was their declared intention, to push the people to the point where they turned again on the state. So, you know, to a degree, the state was controlling not only the dire economic circumstances, but also the efforts by the West, the continued efforts to push again this regime change further among the people who were suffering because of Western policies in Syria. And this is, like, we see this time and time again. And unfortunately, people forget history. They forget who is the root cause of what is going on. Show me one government in the world today that is genuinely democratic or has no corruption, and would not have a greater amount of corruption if they were living under the circumstances that Syrians were living under. Those kind of siege, blockade, war, deprivation circumstances are what breeds corruption. I'm not excusing it, but I'm saying there are reasons behind it that everyone is not contextualizing right now. Everyone is playing the blame game. Everyone wants to blame the Syrian Arab army, which kind of infuriates me, because the Syrian Arab army, whatever you think of them, and there are bad elements in the Syrian Arab army, just as there are bad elements throughout the world in any kind of institution or organization, but they're also very good ones. And those very good ones now are being lumped together with the potential bad ones who may have played a part in the standing down of the Syrian forces and the surrender, basically, but at whose behest? And that's what nobody is asking. Nobody is coming up with any kind of, well, hold on, this is weird. Like, why would they fight for 14 years? Why would President Assad 2 weeks ago make a statement at the Arab League summit shaming the Gulf states that he's supposed to be in bed with, but he actually condemned them for not supporting Palestine and not ending the genocide? You know, why would a president who has been consistent as anything to his causes, to his ideology, to his country for 24 years, suddenly break with his own ideology just like that? Why would an army that's been fighting with nothing, on salaries of $50 and less per month, with equipment that is far lower grade than the terrorists are being provided, with NATO member states supporting them, and Israel, and now Ukraine providing them with drone technology in the Northwest, etc. Like, why would they suddenly put their weapons down unless there is someone masterminding it behind the scenes? And in my opinion, the country that I think is the most likely to be doing that is Russia. And, you know, I've been very open about saying this, because if I look now at what Russia is doing and what the statements that are being put out, and I always said from the moment that Trump was elected, we're going to see deals happen. Trump was elected on doing a deal on Ukraine with Russia and ending the war in Ukraine, right? So what if, and as I said, I'm speculating, but I'm investigating and I'm gathering information to substantiate what I'm saying. I just can't necessarily release that information right now. But what if Russia did a deal on Ukraine? What if Russia is moving its military base from Syria to Libya, as we're seeing and we're being told? I mean, even CNN reported it yesterday. Even CNN. I mean, I know that they're not reliable, but it's now getting into Western media. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say. And they are definitely reducing their footprint in Syria. And it doesn't appear to me to be tenable for them to maintain a military footprint in a country that is now devoid of any defense capability, thanks to Israel, and is now effectively occupied by Israel and the United States and Turkey. And Turkey has betrayed Russia, one could say, over the ceasefire agreement in the Northwest. So in my opinion, you know, Russia considered Syria to be a drain. They considered it to be untenable, really, long term. And then particularly if there was an agreement to secure concessions in Ukraine, to keep, for example, the Black Sea ports and Crimea and so on, to move to Libya and to sacrifice Syria for those gains in Ukraine. It's the only thing that makes sense to me based on a lot of the information that I have. And there were certain Syrian army commanders that, as far as I know, were the ones who stood down. Many didn't. And many Syrian army factions or brigades also didn't. And we're seeing that now, that some of the brigades are forming resistance factions on the border with Lebanon, and they're putting out statements that they are not going to surrender despite the betrayal of the high command. That was the wording in one of the videos that they put out. So yeah, sorry.
What I just to interject here, what would be the betrayal of the high command? Like, who exactly would have given that order? Because since we've talked about this, there's been more information about, different a soldier saying they were told to stand down, and all of that. So because again, they were getting blamed, and they said no, we were told to stand down. Is there any other information in terms of that? Who would have been like the high command?
Um, well, there are certain elements of the high command of the Syrian Arab Army that are effectively under control of Russia, not under
Okay.
the control of the Syrian state. I mean,
I
when
see.
people talk about, well, Russia offered to improve the army, personally, I would question that, because Russia was already very much allied to certain elements within the Syrian Arab Army and had been fortifying those elements. But as a result, in my opinion, again, those elements were definitely more under the control of Russia, or collaborating with Russia, let's say, on Syrian territory, than they were under the control of the Syrian state and the Syrian Ministry of Defense. So again, this is speculation, but looking at the soldiers that are putting out the statement, that would make sense, because they come from that brigade.
Yeah. And what people need to understand and about Russia, just as somebody that's in the region,
Mm.
they're a very pragmatic
Yeah.
country. They are a capitalist country. They are a country that, and I share this point of view with you, that isn't a revolutionary. It's not a revolutionary government. They simply, their act was considered revolting against the status quo because they did go after NATO, and they did
Mm.
go stand their ground against that incursion into their land and their people. And of course, they've been persecuting that path and continuing that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the way people have placed a lot of, just again, this rose-colored glass image on Russia being the same as, say, Venezuela or Syria.
Mm.
And as for me, as from my own sources, there's a lot of people in Latin America that are worried
Mm.
about now the relationships between Russia and several of the major anti-imperialist countries, whether it's Nicaragua, whether it's Venezuela
Mm.
in particular, and Cuba, because now they see, well, if they're from their perspective, they said it day one. Actually, it looks like there was some sort of deal made via Russia because they had more control in the region. You didn't see Iran, in spite of Pezeshkian and his statements that I have called
Mm.
out many times, and him as a reformist, which I don't think is great for Iran. You didn't see that same sort of control in involvement of Iran
Mm.
in Syria at all. So it's not just coming from you. I have seen this
Yeah.
coming from other people as well. So I just wanted to point that
Mm.
out.
Yeah, and I think Iran, from what I'm hearing, sorry, the dog is opening the curtain, so the light is changing. Thanks, Elsa.
Oh,
Um, from what I'm also hearing is that Iran, obviously, it was trying to reinforce the Syrian Arab Army. At a certain point, it decided to withdraw, but I'm now hearing that possibly, this is coming from a couple of sources, that Turkey actually said to them, look, don't get involved, stay out, we'll give free, we'll allow your forces to get out safe, but that's the only thing we can guarantee. So this kind of makes sense why Iran withdrew its forces, and why it was kind of pushing Assad to make the request, to make the official
yeah.
request, because Iran, it's not neighboring Syria, so it has to be careful under an international law perspective not to be seen as invading. Although, of course, Western countries have their own rule-based order, which it means that they can invade anything at any time, and it's fine. and the same for Israel, of course. But no, I think my feeling now is that Iran was very much squeezed out of the deal. It was kind of more of a junior player in Syria from that perspective, and that the control was very rapidly taken by Turkey in particular and by Russia. And I think I think Russia had control over what was going on from Aleppo onwards. Now, I know, and I have said this publicly, that there were brigades in the east of Aleppo that were not going to stand down. They were continuing to fight. And this is why, when everybody is saying, oh, the Syrian Arab army are useless, they're this, they're cowards, and so on. No, this is not true. And people need to stop being so reductionist in this. It's an incredibly complex situation. And I'm only just sort of scratching the surface, but I think I'm probably getting a little bit deeper than a lot of the people that are commenting on social media, for example, And at that point, Sergei Kessel, who was the commander of the Russian forces, left, and he went back to Haimamim. So he abandoned the Syrian army on the eastern outskirts of Aleppo. And although they carried on a bombing campaign ostensibly, and they were putting out statements saying that they'd killed like 500, 600,000 terrorists and so on. Again, I was told by two very reliable sources today that these numbers were crazy, and that actually Russia, in a sense, was continuing the bombing campaign to just look as if it was involved. But as soon as the terrorists arrived at Hama city, they pretty much throttled back. And it was only the Syrian Air Force that was continuing for a short time until, of course, they realized that everyone was starting to surrender. In Homs, there were, again, Hezbollah fighters who were intent on standing in Homs, because, of course, Homs is instrumental to Hezbollah because it's on the main supply lines. It's close to Al-Qusayr, it's close to Mesyaf. Mesyaf is one of the weapons development centers, or the primary one really, in Syria. And Al-Qusayr is I guess, the main border crossing or supply line into Lebanon for Hezbollah from Syria. So for Hezbollah, Homs was pivotal, but then at that point also Turkey, I think, was giving instructions, look, you can get out, but that's it. You don't stay and fight. And this is based, I am speaking to a lot of people, both in military, still in Syria, some that have left, some, a lot of sources that I put a lot of trust in. So, and it kind of makes sense to me knowing what had happened on the ground. So, it's the case of kind of piecing it all together. And I think for me, the biggest sign is really the response from Russia has been very weird. It's been very muted. It hasn't been the response of a country caught off guard or kind of, lost something that was very important to them. It's been a very low-key response, and it's now talking about potentially normalizing with HTS. It's like, I think it's very telling, because if this were Ukraine, I don't think you would see such a kind of muted response from people like Lavrov and Zakharova and so on.
Yeah, I mean, and Zaharova did give a statement talking about how, the United States is involved. And yeah, Israel has been honest about how, their intentions, but it was not talking about Turkey, and it was not really focused on what Israel has done specifically. And you're right about that. And one of the things that has also been in the forefront of media, and as you say, like, all this media that has been doing very reductive analysis, just completely saying, okay, Assad's to blame, that's it, like, it's logically, it doesn't make sense. And also, I recall when this was going on, the channels were saying, oh, we're getting information, we've destroyed all of these terrorists. So that it really wouldn't make sense if those numbers were legitimate that
Mm.
they would have fallen, that would have
Yeah,
happened.
well, yeah, because
Th-
when we were hearing that, it was like, oh, great, cool. It'll be over in a couple of days. Like
yeah,
really, everyone
yeah,
was feeling optimistic at that point. And so therefore, when Hamas, when they were suddenly in the center of Hamas, we were all like, huh? Like, how did that happen? And the Syrian Christian towns of Mahade and Skalbia were suddenly surrounded, and Mahade actually pretty much surrendered. And I still don't know the full story of what happened in Skalbia. So suddenly, like everything suddenly seemed to turn off.
yeah,
And that was the shock point, because up until then, we all had this idea, or maybe, and this kind of ties in with some of the theories that are floating around, that Russia set this big trap for the NATO member states and Israel and the terrorists and so on. Yeah, to a degree, that's what I was saying. I was actually saying, well, this is interesting. What if Russia is drawing them out from Idlib so that they can be destroyed? But then I couldn't understand why they weren't being destroyed. Like, how
yeah.
come they're still advancing? How come there's so many of them when they're in the open? They're not underground. They're in the open. They're moving. There's convoys moving. Like, why on earth couldn't those convoys be destroyed? So I,
And I
I
have
sort
to,
of, you know,
yeah, well, and I just wanted to say, I have to say on that theory of 5D chess or six-dimensional chess, and that this is just, the people that are losing or winning actually is crazy to me.
yeah, I
It
know.
feels like mass formation psychosis or something, just people trying,
Yeah,
and I get it. Like, I mean, I wish
yeah.
that were true.
Oh,
I
me
just, I'm not
too.
buying
I wish I wasn't talking about what we're talking about, to be honest. I wish we were like 2 weeks ago and everything was normal, and
yeah.
everyone was expecting an attack from Idlib, but nothing of this scale, because of course we didn't factor in the attack from the north, from Turkey and from Turkey's proxies. That wasn't factored in. People were preparing for the Jolani attack, sure,
Mhm.
but no one was ready for the full-on Turkish attack also from the north. So it was, um, maybe certain people, very high level people, were aware of it, but nobody on the ground was aware of it, that Turkey would also be attacking alongside HTS, because really they were rivals.
One of the things that I wanted to touch on is Bashar al-Assad's statement, Vanessa. Well, alleged statement, I have to say, that was put out in a former channel, a government channel on
Mm,
Telegram and on other aspects. But we do know that HTS fully controls the social media and the state media of
mm.
all of the former government. So what do you make of Assad's statement? Because he said some very interesting things there. He didn't really say, put any finger or any
Mm.
impetus on Russia. He didn't really specify too much, and it just seems to end abruptly. The letter. What do you make of that statement? And how certain are we that it was actually he who wrote it?
I think there's, like, I still have a lot of questions. One, I
Yeah.
don't understand why international media would not jump at publishing a statement from the deposed president. I mean, they've been trying to get hold of him. They've been trying to find out where he is. So if he's actually offering up a statement for publication, they would jump at it. I mean, even during his presidency, they were desperate for interviews with the president. So of course they would want to publish it. So that's number one. I don't quite understand why it wasn't able to be published in Western media if someone did genuinely reach out to Western media to publish it. The second thing is that HTS, again, according to my sources in Syria, have control of all of the public channels. So that would include the
Mhm.
channel of the presidency. Now, I know there is a rumor that the president had the password, and so therefore he got onto his own Telegram channel, or the presidency Telegram channel, and published the statement there. That's a little bit far-fetched for me, only because the system in Syria, I don't honestly think that the president would have the password to Telegram channels or Facebook or any of these social media channels. I could be wrong, but this is just how I'm seeing it. Now, does that mean that someone else published it on his behalf? Could be. Could it again be Russia? Possibly, and that's why there's no reference to Russia, because at the end of the day, he's on humanitarian asylum, which is also kind of quite insulting. I mean, humanitarian asylum for a former ally and president of a country is kind of a it's kind of insulting, to be honest, because it's sort of, instead of just giving him asylum or political asylum, it's humanitarian. So in other words, Russia is to be perceived as saving his life.
Yeah, good point.
Didn't think it's not very normal for an ally and for someone that is perceived to be in political danger. Because if we remember also, in the early days, I mean, it was only 10 days, but in the early days, there was a statement put out by Sputnik that the president would remain for 6 months, I think, and would be part of the transitional process. And then that suddenly seemed to, so clearly, in a way, I guess that negotiating was finished and was rejected, right? And so maybe at that point, it was realized that there was going to be real danger, sort of Gaddafi type danger for the president if he and his family were to stay. Now, those that are saying he betrayed his people, again, are they looking at the consistency of the president? Whether you like him or not, it's irrelevant. Whether you like Putin or not, it's irrelevant. He's consistent in his statements, right? And not only that, but he was in Moscow for his son's graduation with his family. Why, if he were thinking of leaving, and one assumes that he would have been planning it according to the Financial Times and so on, they're all trying to present this image of him having been planning this for a long time. If he were planning it for a long time, why would he come back and put his entire family in danger by bringing them back to Syria at that point? And his son was with him when he was forced to leave. Right. So why would you do that? If you've already made plans to betray your own closest people, to betray your country, to betray your army, why would you come back from Moscow when you're going to go to Moscow anyway for asylum? Right. There's many things that just don't make any sense for me. And I think the rush to judgment over it was kind of scary because I'm really not an advocate of rush judgments anyway, because we don't have any of the facts. At that point, we didn't have any of the facts. Everyone was in shock. Everyone was disoriented. Everyone was emotional. And it's very easy to lash out. And another thing that strikes me, Syria is a patriarchal society. You said it's not a democracy, but I mean, we won't get into a discussion of what is democracy, because I don't think it really exists anywhere. But it's a patriarchal society, right? And the president has been seen as that patriarch, however dreadful his government has been, and they really have been, over many, many different issues. So for me, it's kind of a natural reaction that when something as seismic as this happens, they're going to blame the dad, they're going to blame the patriarch, they're going to blame the person that is now being portrayed as having betrayed them. Right? It's a natural human reaction. If something goes wrong in a family, who's usually the person that gets the blame? It's the dad. If the dad is kind of responsible for I don't know, doing something which makes your life more difficult, or so on and so forth. it's common sense for me. And I just think I'm leaving my mind open, but I want way more substantiation that that's actually what happened. And for me right now, I'm finding more information that is leading me to believe that he was forced into doing what he did. He had no choice in the end.
That honestly has been my conclusion as well, just based on everything I've seen. And just just watching people without any ounce of evidence, just fully. And you're right, the people of Syria, sure, they have reasons, they have a completely different experience, but watching journalists and watching others that haven't been in Syria actually recently and have just flat out just say no, it does seem that that's the narrative status quo. That's the narrative they would want us to take, because that narrative divides people further. That narrative completely distracts from the actual culprits that are actually at fault. That narrative weakens the belief in somebody like Assad, and that somebody like that would exist. And it also creates this cloud of complete and total just negativity as to, you know, the entire region and the capabilities of not just Syrians but of people of West Asia. And I've seen that pivot, and it's been really just awful to see from a lot of people who you know are supposed anti-Zionists. And I really am finding that it's hard to not feel like this is some sort of just manipulated narrative that's thrown out there. And the arrogance coming from some of these Westerners really is astonishing. And I do think there's an element of, you know, and I'm careful when I say this, but racial, at the very least, racial superiority to that, some element of arrogance.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I said this, if you remember, we were talking about the whole situation, and I said, well, what better way to demoralize even the closest, let's say, I'm not even going to say the closest to Assad or the closest to the government or anything like that, but the closest to the idea of Syria as this pluralist, secular country. If the leader that enabled and protected that secularism and that pluralism betrayed them, what better way to demoralize any counter resistance to the HTS occupation right now, or even the Israeli occupation or the Turkish occupation? What better way to do it than to leave this vacuum of, like, you know, believing that everything that you believed in was based on a house of cards? What better way to do it? And as you said, to distract from those that were really behind whatever level of betrayal went on, both within the Syrian armed forces and within the allies in Syria. You know, it's kind of, yeah, and you're right, talking about the Latin American countries. I mean, they're watching this very closely because BRICS is still in its infancy. And, you know, I've had it said to me that, well, you know, if Russia is going to pull this kind of trick, then we might as well stay with the US, because what's the difference?
And that's not something you want to hear, especially when you're trying to build this supposed alternative to that thought process. And the last thing I want to say, Vanessa, is, you know, what I picture is there is a sense of not understanding coming from these supposed axis of I'm not talking about the axis of resistance in West Asia, but I'm talking about the supposed anti-imperialist axis that's supposed to stand against NATO. There seems to be a lack of cohesion, a lack of unity, because there's such a quick acceptance, for example, to the new Syrian government from the UN, from Russia, from others, just to as if they're a legitimate government, when when it's the other way around. The US and NATO, they don't recognize Maduro. as president, and they ensure that none of their partners recognize Maduro. They sanction Russia, and they say you also have to sanction Russia. I'm sorry, but we don't have that kind of unity of the
No.
people that are actually anti-imperialist. And I think some countries that are not anti-imperialist necessarily are being called anti-imperialist. So I just want to
Yeah,
hear your take on that.
I think, I mean, it's been incredibly well orchestrated and very well managed. I can't deny that. And what we're seeing, of course, is the cohesion of the US aligned bloc, right? And this is what we always see is the lack of cohesion amongst resistance factions and resistance states. And this was always something, this is what Trump does. Like, I've been saying this for such a long time. This is what he did in 2016, and this is what he's managed to do again this time. This is his role. This is why it was his time to be elected. Biden was
Yep.
the bomber and the destroyer of Palestine and Lebanon, and of course still Syria to some degree, because Trump is still awaiting his inauguration. But this is what Trump does. This is what Trump generates, is this kind of national interests over international, Russia's security over alliance with China, and so on. And of course, we have to remember this is also about isolating China, because if a deal
Yeah.
can be done with Russia, that isolates China, that enables the US to begin its war against China, which is most likely going to be initially certainly a kind of economic war, right? So what better way to do it than to isolate Iran and Russia? Iran, because it's now facing attack from Israel, because now Israel has complete freedom in the skies of Syria. Not only is it bombing everything in Syria related to military and defense infrastructure, but it now has the skies of Syria to attack Iran from. And potentially, there will be an attempt to destabilize the resistance factions inside Iraq and to create a security belt in Iraq leading up to the borders of Iran, using the Kurdish factions in Syria and Iraq and Iran to enable and facilitate that. So Iran is facing its own kind of existential war right now. Russia potentially is looking after its own interests from a realpolitik perspective. As you said, they're pragmatic. They're not 5D chess players. They're not ideologically driven to defend the Middle East. We saw that really in Palestine.
Yeah.
I mean, they stuck to the two-state solution. They often didn't condemn Israel to the extent that they should have done, right? They played a very middle ground political game
Yeah.
on that one.
Well, that's that Israeli relationship as well.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So they're not ideologically driven to defend Syria. Let's face it. And maybe they were frustrated with Bashar al-Assad because he was very intransigent, for example, over speaking to Erdogan.
Yeah.
Maybe this was one mistake that he made. Maybe he should have come to the table with Erdogan and brokered a deal. But he was intransigent, and this frustrated the hell out of Russian negotiators here, because they just wanted the whole thing ended. So there is also potential that Bashar's ideological intransigence also just pissed Russia off to the point where we're like, okay, like, we can't handle this. We're not ideologically invested in this war. Let's sort something out and hand it over. That's also another aspect that I'm just kind of speaking aloud right now. And I've completely forgotten the question.
No, you answered it, I think, in essence, of the lack of unity between the resistance factions. Yeah, you've answered it. And well, unfortunately, it looks like we're headed. Syria is not headed in a direction anywhere near what it used to be. It looks like we've seen the UK, the Washington, Israel pretty much come in like scavengers and try to take whatever they can. What do you see as the future of Syria at this point?
I mean, I do think if I'm looking for a tiny bit of hopium, which is genuine, I do think you're going to start seeing kind of vigilante resistance groups, particularly in areas that are really under threat, like the Alawite communities, the Christian communities, the borders. It may be that Syrian army forces that didn't want to stand down will actually join forces with, for example, Hezbollah, because Hezbollah isn't sectarian. I mean, there are Sunni, there are Christian factions within Hezbollah also. So I think you are going to see a pushback when people understand fully what has happened, and they're not accepting. People are really not happy with living under an Islamist government, basically, that is going to take the country backwards into away from pluralism, away from being a very progressive reformist society. They're going to take it backwards, and that's what the West always does. Whether it's the Taliban, whether it's Al Qaeda, it doesn't really matter. That's what they want to do because they don't want global South countries to develop, right? And obviously, Turkey and Qatar are now talking about the pipeline that originally President Assad had turned down, and that's what led, amongst other factors, to the regime change war in 2011, because he favored the Iranian-Russian pipeline, the Iranian-Iraq pipeline. So that's one aspect. Turkey, of course, is going to incorporate or annex Syrian territory into Turkey as part of the Neo-Ottoman Empire agenda. Israel has made it clear that it's going to settle on the territory that it's already invaded in the south. There are multiple displacements going on there. People are really terrified there as to what is going to happen. I mean, it's a choice between the Zionists and HTS, which is not great for anybody. Jordan, of course, is going to be put under pressure to take Gazan refugees to finally ethnically cleanse Gaza in particular. Since Trump's election, Zionist regime officials are talking about complete annexation of the West Bank. And Syria has no defense now, thanks to HTS, who basically did nothing other than to condemn Israeli violation of Syrian airspace while it's bunker buster bombing over 500 times areas of Syria, which is now including civilian areas. There were civilian houses targeted in Tartus and in the Damascus suburbs. So, Syria, it can be argued, is no longer right now a sovereign state. It's a partitioned, balkanized territory, which has no army, no defense, no leadership, other than some ridiculous transitional government that is being feted by every single EU, UK, US official, with the EU in full-blown hypocrisy, saying that, oh yeah, no, we should lift the sanctions, we should provide humanitarian aid for rebuilding and so on, having allowed the Syrian people to be blockaded, starved, energy deprived for 14 years. I mean, it's so clear what the game has been. And now to present HTS as the ones bringing inflation down, the ones suddenly finding foreign currency and so on, and providing electricity and water. This all could have been done before for the Syrian people. But they preferred to deprive the Syrian people of everything in order to blame President Assad and the government for that.
Wow. Well, this is, I mean, the way you just laid it all out, I mean, it's what I've come to understand, but it is very negative, right? It's a very, we're in a very awful place right now for Syria and Syrians, and I think shock is still the word. I think there's still a sense of shock that it could have happened. So, Vanessa, I won't keep you much longer. Thank you so much for having this conversation. As always, it's very insightful to have. Apart from your Substack, where else can people find you in case they haven't heard of you by now?
Yeah, Substack, Telegram, X, kind of YouTube. But that's about it. Substack, everything goes up at Substack. I mean, I have got the Wool, which is my website, but I update that less regularly, I have to admit. But yeah, Substack, if people go there, they can subscribe.
And she's on UK Column as well.
Oh,
Right.
yeah, thank you for reminding me.
All right, that's it, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, don't just, take the narrative that's given, always question and seek more. We'll see you next time. Bye.